Dr. Bickmore YA Wednesday in Conversation. And today my guest is Robert Lipsyte. And many of you should know Robert Lipsyte if you're of any age at all, close to me, as the author of The Contender and famously one of the sports writers who covered the fight of then Cassius Clay with Sonny Liston. And for those of you that are too young, Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali, who's one of the greatest boxers in the history of sports, maybe the greatest. And so, Robert, you have an interesting career where early in your career, you're covering one of the most noted boxers in the world and writing one of the very first, what we would call modern young adult novels. So tell us a little bit about who you are as a sports writer. How did a young guy like you become a sports writer?
Well, it's interesting, Steve. The two events were connected, covering Muhammad Ali and writing The Contender. It was well into his career. He was already champion. It was 1965. And I was covering Muhammad Ali fighting Floyd Patterson in Las Vegas.
Huh?
And the night before the fight, I took a very old boxing manager out to dinner. He was kind of down on his luck and kind of hanging around. Of course, he was much younger than I am now, but to me, in my 20s, he was a really old guy. And he started telling me a story about a gym that he had owned earlier in his career that had 3 dark, twisting flights of stairs. And he would sleep at night in his gym at the top of the stairs on a cot with a German Shepherd and a pistol. But what he was really listening for was a kid, some kid, to come up those dark, twisting stairs. And the kid would come alone. He would come at night, and his footsteps would be hesitant, as if he was conquering fear. And if a kid like that came up, he would know that the kid could be a contender, somebody who could, fight for himself, fight for a championship, not necessarily win, but at least, be becoming, be somebody. And I was mesmerized by this image of the dark stairs. I covered the fight. It went back to New York, and waiting for me in the Times office was a letter from an editor, Ferdinand Monjo, at Harper and Row. And he said, "We've been reading your stories. Would you be interested in writing a novel with boxing as its milieu?" Now, I don't know how to pronounce that word or spell it, but I do remember it. And wow, I was so thrilled. Can you imagine? So I called him right up and I said, yes, I would love to do it. And it's about 3 flights of stairs and a kid, and I'm going to call it The Contender. And he said, go to it, young man, go to it. And in my naivete, I thought it was like a contract, but which was a good thing. Because I just sat down and I wrote The Contender, and I had wonderful support at Harper and Row from Ferdy, from Ursula Nordstrom, who was kind of the queen of YA literature, would become so, and Charlotte Zolotow, one of her editors, who also in his tiny little green ink wrote on my manuscript many, many things to make better. You can do better than this. So that's how it all started, and it was kind of thrilling. I didn't think of it as a children's book or a YA book or anything like that. I thought it was just a novel, and a short novel, but it was
Yeah.
just a novel with a 17-year-old protagonist. And there was kind of maybe a sex scene in there. I mean, and it was a political scene in there, and they both disappeared.
Yeah.
And
Well,
uh, and it became, a lot of kids liked reading it because I think that it was realistic. It was of the moment. It had a black protagonist,
yeah.
which was not common at that time. Um, and it's interesting. I sometimes wonder whether I could write a black protagonist today. I
Yeah.
mean, I felt I knew the kid really well because I covered boxing. I had written Dick Gregory's autobiography. I had
Yeah.
spent a lot of time in Harlem and Bedford-Stuyvesant, the African American neighborhoods in New York. My parents were school teachers in basically black schools where I
No.
visited a lot. So it never occurred to me that as a reporter I couldn't find out anything I needed to know and write about it. But
That's
it's an
certainly a
interesting issue
question.
now.
That's certainly a question today, isn't it?
So,
Whether we can write from another perspective. And I've got to tell you, you mentioned a couple of things that younger teachers and students, you're talking about getting feedback on a manuscript. People remember that in those days, you'd have to type it all up, you know, put it in an envelope, send it to the editor. They'd write on it, maybe do some kind of copying, Xerox, or, in those days they had mimeograph machines, and then send it back and you had to do
right.
editing. I can remember that. I used to tell my students when I was teaching, because I graduated from college in 78. And I tell my students, I graduated from college before the invention of the personal computer. So everything I did in college, I typed on a typewriter. I did that, and my very first manuscript as a professor, even in 2003, I had to send a hard copy, with the paper, with a disc
Right.
inside of it. And they, sent back. So it's only been really in the last 20 years that people who have been publishing have been doing completely online submissions and doing all those things. So the journey from your first novel to a novel today looks a lot different for audiences, right?
Yes, it was.
I've got
Uh,
a
I still have the original manuscript, and I go back and look at it and get good writing tips from 55, 60 years ago.
well, have you got, are you gonna, is some library gonna curate your letters for you, and your all your manuscripts?
I've never really pursued it. I've given things to different places, but I haven't found, maybe one. I haven't found a place to give Contender. I think that might be the most interesting, is
Yeah.
the original manuscripts of the Contender.
I think I don't remember if you've ever met Joan Caywell. Joan Caywell,
Yes, I have. Yes.
Joan has, at the University of Southern Florida, where she was, there is a large library, and they started focusing on first editions signed by authors, but
Mhm.
they've started to curate letters of some of the early young adult writers. But I can put you in contact with Joan if you're interested in, but because I think there's an ongoing commitment and dedication to keeping papers and stuff of young adult writers because of the work Joan has done. I got to tell you a story about the Contender that's personal. Is, I was born in 55, so when the book comes out in the 60s, I read it when it was new as a middle
Really?
grade
Yeah.
student, but I didn't know that I read it as an adult, because I read everything. I read as much as I could find, if books were in school, I read it. And then later, when I became a teacher, um, and was studying to be a teacher, I took a class, and this is 10 or 15 years later, and somebody assigned the book The Contender, and I opened it and I said, started reading. I said, I've read this book. This is a book I know, because, like you say, the images and the staircase are so dominant. As you read it, you go, oh, I'm remembering that. And then I taught English classes and honors, and I didn't teach a lot of young adult literature. And then again, when I was doing it in earnest as getting a PhD, I thought, well, I better read those 3 books again that people keep talking about, The Chocolate War, The Contender, The Outsiders. And then I read The Contender. I've read this a lot of times. I love this book. So it's one of the books that has kept resurfacing in my career. And I think that critics say what they want, but I think you do a really good job of inhabiting somebody who's not you, right? And giving all that credit, and the disclaimers that you're writing outside of your own personal experience. You certainly get a sense of who this kid is, I think, and the loneliness, and the separation from society and the ways people are doing. I think you do a wonderful job. So, but
Thank you. I mean, it's been a constant joy. The Contender is still in print and selling, and I get letters from guys whose grandsons are reading the book, and they come into their grandson's house and, what are you reading? Oh my God, I read that one, and that's thrilling. I mean, I have
yeah,
to. You can imagine how wonderful that is,
yeah,
and so we press on. I guess one of the problems, and I understand the idea that that people have a certain turf consciousness
yeah,
about their own people, and I think a lot of it is money driven, um, because the idea that I was under when I wrote that book in my 20s, when I knew even less than I know now, was that we're all pretty much the same in the when we get down to those feelings of alienation, of loneliness, of hope, of fear, and it doesn't really matter that much, and that has always been my experience.
yeah. And it's really interesting. And I've known that you wrote with Dick Gregory, his autobiography. How was that experience? And how did you and Dick converse about writing that? Because today, if they were getting somebody to help them write a biography, they wouldn't choose, a Black person wouldn't choose a white co-writer for that book. But I'd be really interested in those conversations you had with Dick about that, because he's a great person. He's a great icon in
He
American
was,
history.
yeah. Well, that's very interesting you bring that up because uh, I think he ran through almost every writer in the East Coast, um, and he kept rejecting writers. He didn't like them. He didn't like their raincoat. I mean, and so finally it came down to me, and this was the day after 4 little girls died in the Birmingham bombing, in the church bombing.
Yeah.
And he was just lying in his bed in a fetal position crying. And, I talked and listened. I think ultimately he chose me because, one, I seemed open to what he was saying, but two, I think he felt that there was an advantage in having a white writer because he felt that Black people understood his story, knew his story, had lived some version of his own story. But whites hadn't. And he wanted somebody who could, in a sense, be a translator as well as a collaborating writer, somebody who would write in a way that white people would understand, that it wouldn't be narrowly black.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character. Because I used to teach some of the short things he wrote. I think one of them is called "Broke Not Poor" or "Poor Not Broke," about a family at
Right. Yeah.
Thanksgiving. And it was a powerful story, because I taught in a community in Salt Lake City where 99% of the students were white, and occasionally we'd have some Native Americans or Polynesians, and it was a long time before we had African American students in our schools. It wasn't until the 80s. You mentioned also another writer that I'd love to interview sometime is Sheila P. Moses, who was very close to Dick Gregory,
Mhm,
and
right.
wrote a memoir with him later, about probably 25 years later. I think
Right.
"Callous on My Soul," and it tells a different kind of, kind of a more expansive. And I think that it was great that Dick was able to do that, have these two different books from
Yeah.
two different
Well,
time periods and
Callous
perspectives.
on My Soul was the original title of my book
Yeah.
with Dick. Yeah. But I didn't like it, and he didn't like it. It sounded too much. But remember, it was a more militant time when
Yes.
Dick and I wrote
Yep.
than
Yeah,
when Sheila
absolutely.
wrote her book. And some of the battles had been, if not won, at least joined by Sheila's time. So we went to the can I use the N word on your program?
I'm sitting here thinking the same thing. Probably we're safer to just say the title of the book is the N word, right?
Yeah,
And and I think you're right that during a militant time, it was, and I think Dick was intentionally provocative in a lot of things he did, in his
right.
comedy, in trying to do that. And him putting that forward is certainly different than you and I putting it forward, right?
Yeah, but you're right. See, his idea was the book would be so wildly successful, you know, biggest bestseller of all time, that the word would lose its power.
Power. Yeah.
And in fact, the dedication is, to my mama. If you ever hear the word again, they're advertising my book. You know,
Well, and
um,
I think there's several people that tried to say that by using the word in a certain way and a certain group of people using the word, it would lose its
right,
power. And I think to some degree that was true. But again, I think the racism in the United States is so entrenched in a lot of people, a lot of
right.
communities, that it didn't work to the degree that he wanted it to work. It certainly worked at
No.
some level, and became
Although,
very important, but it's a
yeah,
difficult
although
task.
I would say, Steve, that the word had less power then than it does now.
I,
And the power of it all comes from having to say the N word,
right,
which I
right,
think in many ways is more obscene than saying the word itself.
yeah,
Because you're
it's,
saying, oh, this word has such power. Well,
yeah,
the idea is to strip it of its power,
yeah,
right?
yeah. It's a really interesting, um, it's a really interesting language dance, right? And you've certainly worked with words and worked with language, um, and we're interviewing. I imagine some of the conversations you must have had with Muhammad Ali and some of the other fighters that you knew over the years, who are not only fighting battles in the ring, but fighting battles outside of the ring, and trying to be engaged in the world and in the community in different ways. I can't imagine, for example, what it might have been like to be covering Muhammad Ali when all of a sudden he can't box, right? When he's protesting, and
Yeah.
that must have been I would have loved to be a fly on the wall when you and others tried to approach him for conversations about that, right?
Well, actually, in many ways, that was the most interesting time. Um, when he originally challenged Sonny Liston in 1964, uh, no one thought that he had any kind of a chance. It
Yeah,
was a sacrifice to the box office,
yeah,
and the odds were 7-1. And the boxing writer for the New York Times, and boxing was very important in those days.
yeah. Oh, yeah,
So he was kind of an important figure, and he didn't want to cover the fight. I mean, he said, "Why should I go all the way down to Florida? It's going to be over in maybe a minute." And then he uttered these famous words, which were, "Why don't you send the kid from Night Rewrite? He ain't doing anything." Well, I was the kid on Night Rewrite. Um, and my immediate instructions were, as soon as I flew to Florida, to Miami, rent a car and drive back and forth between the arena and the nearest hospital, so I would waste no deadline time following Cassius Clay into intensive care. I actually did it. But most of the reporters down there were older guys because it was a
yeah,
heavyweight championship. And so he and I were kind of the same age,
yeah.
and we kind of bonded. And so I loved covering him, and I loved covering when he couldn't fight, because you just kind of hang out somewhere and talk. And he would go on college campuses, he would go into church, he would do a lot of things that you could just follow around. And
Yeah.
I love that part of it.
That's a great story. It's a great moment of history, and I remember we had dinner once at NCTE and talked briefly about that. The other thing people don't know about you is that not only you had this long career, and that Contender's not your only book, and you
Well,
have some other boxing books, and you have a book that I love the title of, the One Fat Summer, which is kind of a memoir of sorts for you. Isn't that the case?
but One Fat Summer became a movie with Donald Sutherland, and they wouldn't use the title. But nowadays, you can't say fat, right?
Yeah,
That's the F word.
that's
And
right.
so it's called Measure of a Man, which is, it was a very good movie, and it was really interesting because um, One Fat Summer is set in the 1950s. The movie was set in the 1970s. The music was different. A lot of the sensibility was different. And in the book, the kid loses weight, as I did that summer. The kid loses his weight. In the movie, he doesn't lose his weight. He becomes comfortable with the way he looked, which
Uh-huh.
is really a very modern sensibility.
Wow, that's interesting. When you're a busy sports writer. When did you find time to pick up these novels from time to time?
Well, there were periods when I quit, and I wasn't, sports writing, and so it became two separate paths in my professional life, and it was hard, but I really felt, uh, and I have a new one coming out.
Yeah, let's hear about what's the new one going to be about. That'd be interesting.
Well, it's scheduled to be published in January. It's called Rhino's Run, and it's it's about a white guy. Hey,
Yeah.
no complaint there. It's
You're coming
about
around finally to write about your own story, right?
well, I mean, he's a white, straight, kind of conservative football captain, and he's a big deal in his high school. But he's a sensitive guy. He senses something's wrong in a lot of ways. And after a school shooting, he becomes politicized, and he uses a lot of this, strength and leadership that he's learned from football to change things, to begin an agent for change. And I kind of like the idea. I've always felt that I wanted to write for boys,
Yeah.
that boys really need books more than girls do. Girls get a lot of books by very talented female writers who really guide them into a world of relationships and romance and fantasy, and that's wonderful. But I don't think there are enough, really strong books for boys. I mean, some of the writers I've always loved, Robert Cormier,
Yeah.
Chris Crutcher, Jason Reynolds. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a whole thread of really fine male writers, who write from a male sensibility, which is really important. But they're overwhelmed, I think, by women writers. And I'm not one to say that a woman can't write about a male. Absolutely. Uh, but I think that there's a tendency for boys not to want to read books about girls and by girls.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, and certainly there's been a sea change in the last 15 years in young adult literature where the publishers, I think, have sought out a few more male writers. Like Jason Reynolds is a good example. Jason's a great writer,
He
um,
is.
but there had been a time when it would have been much harder for him to break in. I use the example where once people had Walter Dean Myers in their stable, they just had Walter keep writing books. It's almost like they didn't look for another
Yeah.
black writer because, well,
But
Walter,
we got one.
yeah,
We
we
got
have
one.
one.
Yeah.
And a colleague and I, Shanisha, an African American scholar at Salisbury University, we did a 3-series books studying the African American authors from the 60s to the 80s, from the 80s to the 2000s and then 2000s. And overwhelmingly, it's easier to find female African American authors than it is
No.
the others. You can find Walter, Christopher Paul Curtis, and then finally in 2000, it opens up where you can find Jason Reynolds and Varian Johnson, and you get a few more. But initially, that was a hard nut to crack. And I think the same ratio, actually, even though there's more white authors, probably exists. For every Chris Crutcher, you can find 10 really quality women writers, that you mentioned. So I think I'm glad you're doing that. And what a timely setting to have somebody kind of to overuse the word, be woke about an issue when your whole life might be revolving around football and your celebrity, and then something else happens like a school shooting, and you think,
Right.
oh, what is the perspective of the world that I want to be involved in, right? So that's really timely as well. I see it's a book I gotta get the colleagues, because about 4 years ago, um, two colleagues and I wrote a book called Contending with Gun Violence in the English Language Arts Classroom, where we cataloged
Mhm.
how to talk about gun violence. And then COVID hit, so we didn't get a chance to push the book as well as we should have. But in the last 4 years, horrible things have happened, and we're thinking maybe we need to do a new edition of that book, and we can highlight your book in that.
I'm for that.
Yeah, it's good. So are you with the same press? Is this going to come out, and how are
Well,
you?
that's the wonderful thing. HarperCollins is publishing it. And so this is the 13th YA novel of mine, and all have been with them.
Yeah,
And I've had just a marvelous succession of editors. I've been really lucky uh, with my editors. And and that's how it all really came about. There was a 50th anniversary edition of the Contender,
yeah,
and I wrote a foreword for it. And I was assigned, a very young male editor to, guide me through. And when we finished, I really liked him. He was so smart. And, when we finished, the idea was, what a shame. He's too young and I'm too old, and we'll never get a chance to do a book together. And then soon after that, I really wanted to write this book. So I just sat down and wrote it. And when it was finished, I just sent it to him. And the stars were aligned, and
Good.
he did a wonderful job editing it. It was fun. But what's interesting now is the one piece of the puzzle is there's going to be a sensitivity reader.
Oh,
I've never worked with that before. Have you? And
I know of sensitivity readers. In academics, we're supposed to be our own sensitivity readers, right? Or get
uh-huh.
colleagues to do that. But that happens all the time. I just interviewed an author, Lauren Yarrow, who sets her novel in kind of a futuristic Chile, right? In Chile, in South America. So she had 2 or 3 writers, sensitivity writers, to see if she was getting the Spanish right, the
Mhm.
references to Chile right, and it happens all the time now, that they're doing sensitivity readers, which I'm okay with that. I think we need to all be able to take that kind of criticism and perspective and grow with it, right? So
Mhm.
I think that's interesting that they're going to have a sensitivity writer. Are they more focused on the guns and the violence? Are they focused on the athlete? Or
I don't really know. I mean, he gets, he acts up and he gets pushed into a group. A psychologist has a group on campus,
oh,
and among the kids in the group is a trans woman.
okay,
And so, I'm sure the sensitivity reader will say, "What do you know about that?"
yeah. Or how
And
are you doing
I'm
that
gonna
right
say,
or
well,
wrong?
I
Yeah,
don't really know really well a a teenage trans. I know a lot of trans women.
yeah,
I know trans women sports writers. Uh, but so I'm kind of looking forward to it. But I faced this very early on when there was some criticism about, and you brought this up very early in the conversation, a white writer writing Dick Gregory's autobiography.
yeah,
What do you know?
yeah,
Um, and um, and it was basically from other white critics
yeah,
and writers. It wasn't from black people at all.
yeah. It's because I think if Dick Gregory signs off, that's like somebody criticizing Dave Chappelle if he said, "No, I want this guy to write my book." If Dave Chappelle, signs off on it, he's probably aware of what the obstacles might be, right?
I would think so.
Well, and you've been in this role of the critic as well, because I think the last time that we talked, you had just started or been a year into working for as an ombudsman for ESPN. Is that have I
Correct.
got that correct?
Yeah.
So tell everybody a little bit about what that role is, because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. I think eventually ESPN came to realize they made a mistake. Um, they they didn't really want an ombudsman. They wanted somebody saying, "Oh, everything you're doing is so nice and cool." Uh, but the problem was that no journalism organization wants oversight of any
Yeah,
kind. And this is certain, I mean, my alma mater, the New York Times, they didn't either. They had a very good public editor, and then they canceled that. I think that they become very uncomfortable. But it was a wonderful time to be an ombudsman because ESPN is not really a journalistic organization. It's, you know, they're in the business of presenting sporting events and
yeah,
then commenting on the sporting events that they've
right.
just presented in a journalistic way. And boy, does that need oversight? And so there were a lot of things that came up that were just fascinating. They thought it was perfectly all right to out a closeted gay person, a
Oh,
closeted trans woman, without realizing that there are steps to take.
yeah,
And I got so much mail, which was so interesting, from sports fans around
yeah,
the country. And their idea of ESPN was a sanctuary
yeah,
where reality never intruded. And it was this picture of, mom and dad and the kids kind of going into the recreation room, sitting down in front of a massive TV screen and, watching college basketball.
yeah,
Uh, and anything that would intrude on the, uh, fantasy vision of perfection was a problem. I mean, one of the biggest things was the first openly gay college athlete to be drafted by the pros. His name was Sam. And when he was drafted, he gave his partner a really big kiss on ESPN. And ESPN kept running it. I mean, it was the longest kiss since The Princess Bride.
yeah,
And people just went crazy. Okay, a quick peck would have been all right, but not that. And I think that was kind of the kind of issue that we dealt with. It was a wonderful time. They were very nice and they were very cooperative. Ultimately,
yeah,
ESPN, but after my time was over, they did not hire another ombudsman.
yeah. It's tough. Is my wife works in administration, and everybody needs, in school administration, everybody needs a tenth man, right, to say, "What if?" or
Yeah,
"Have we considered?" Right, and because sometimes it's easy to say, "Oh, this is the momentum, and this is where we're going to go," but there needs to be that voice of saying, "Well, maybe there's
wait a
another."
minute. Yeah, exactly that. Take a beat. Take a
Yeah,
beat.
yeah.
Think about it. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll proceed, but maybe you'll think, oh, we need to moderate this way or do the other thing. So that's fascinating. Another thing I'd love to ask writers, and you're a writer, like if you wrote for newspapers, you're under a deadline. You've got to write if it's, if you got a Wednesday and it's a Wednesday story, it's got to be in by Wednesday. So how does your writing change when you write fiction? Or you find you're similar, you plod along and you have goals. So what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I give myself deadlines for things and I keep hours. I mean, I don't wait until I feel like writing. But that, I started at the times when I was 19 years old. So I really, it was like joining a cult. And part of the rules of that cult was the deadline.
Yeah,
So I've internalized, the deadline, and not always necessarily to my advantage,
yeah,
but I'm kind of, driven that way of having to work every day, feeling guilty on Sundays when my wife and family thinks it's a good thing to take off and do something else, maybe. Uh, but so that's, never been a problem. Uh, the problem is not working, stopping, knowing
yeah,
when to stop. And I always tell people, stop in the middle of a sentence so you have something to go back to, but stop at
yeah,
some point. Just don't keep going on and on. And dinner's ready. No, you should be up helping before that.
yeah. So that are you
But I've always had a book in the background going.
oh,
Um, you know, a newspaper. I mean, well, it's a right now. I write a kind of political column for my local paper here on
Oh,
Shelter Island, New York. I write about sports, uh, kind of politicized sports. The last piece I wrote was about comparing the two trials, Donald Trump's trial right now and O.J. Simpson's trial. He had
oh,
just died, and the book. So, I
yeah.
mean, I always feel that I have things going on, and it makes me happy.
So when you say deadlines, are you in the chair at 8 in the morning and write for 3 hours no matter what, or how does it work now? Maybe it was, in the old days it was all day long, 8 to 5, and then leave in the middle of the sentence. But what's it like now?
Well, well, these days, without assignments, sports assignments, because that was when I worked for the paper, that was a traveling job. So
Yeah.
it was very hard, to consistently uh, keep hours writing a book. But when I was writing a book, yeah, that's exactly what it was. 8 o'clock with a cup of coffee, and you go to work. And my son, my son who teaches creative writing at Columbia and as a very well published novelist, people sometimes ask him, were you, um, you know, how did your, father and your late mother, who was also a writer, affect your becoming a writer? And he would say, well, at 8 o'clock in the morning, when these two kind of messy-haired people would go to their computers with their coffee, I figured, well, if they could do that, I could do that.
That's great. That's something that we forget how our very existence models things for children, right? And they
Right,
start
yeah.
seeing things possible because they see them, right, as happening. That's really great.
But
I
I
love
mean, but it also anti-models. My daughter became a very strict lawyer, so
that.
she said, "I don't want to do that."
Yeah. Well, she probably, but still, you can't be a really good lawyer if you're not held to some schedule, some regimen of
Oh
doing
yeah.
that. So in this busy life, did you ever get a chance to do a lot of the school visits that they want authors to do? Did that become part of your world?
Oh, absolutely. And I love that. I mean, one of the, really joyous things is to sit and talk, to middle school and high school kids, about your book. And you're talking about a book, and you're talking about characters that you think you made up, and they're talking about people that they knew. They're talking about old friends of theirs. They're talking about people that kids their age, they came to feel love or hatred or revulsion or whatever for. And I mean, it's very thrilling for a writer to be able to hear about his or her characters in that way.
Yeah, that's great. And you've done some work connected with Alan Brown, and that's one of the reasons who's at Wake Forest. And
Oh
that's one of the
yeah,
reasons I was reminded, I think, why haven't I tried to contact Robert? Because he and his colleagues have a new sports book coming out through NCTE, and they quote you in the article they wrote for my blog that I think comes out next week or the week after. And
yeah,
I should run your conversation the same week that that they're posting theirs so that
yeah.
they both
Well,
play against each other. But you've done some stuff with Alan recently, or
yeah, no, 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 no. Well, not so recently. So Alan had contacted me, and he worked out a system where I was for some years, several years, I was going to Wake Forest for a week or two at a time, several times a year, and talking to classes, and certainly talking to his, YA classes, and then he organized a wonderful group of football players from Wake Forest who went to high schools in the
yes,
Winston-Salem area. Alan Brown is a wonder. He really is dedicated and so smart. But then COVID hit,
Yes.
and that knocked it out. So that kind of stopped about 2 years. It's been 2 years since the end of COVID about,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
uh, and then I had some back problems, so traveling wasn't so easy. And so, things, kind of fell apart. But I had a wonderful, wonderful experience with Alan. Uh, not only his teaching college students, but the way he reached out
To
into
the
the
high
high
school
school
students.
community, and used his students and football players to come talk to kids.
Yeah,
And
that he's done
that
a
was,
wonderful job, and
yes,
I know he talked about that when that was happening. I was aware of several conversations that you were doing that, and he was reaching out to. He came to a summit we had at Las Vegas when I was at UNLV and presented on that. And what advice do you have for people doing the work now? Because you've seen a lot of this change, whether it's going into, is it possible, for example, to be a sports writer today? And what does that look like now breaking in as opposed to when you broke in?
well, it's tougher. I mean, in many ways, it's tougher because the major outlets don't really exist in quite the same way they did back in my time. On the other hand, because of the internet, there are so many places where you can write sports or anything else you want. I mean, there are so many online sites. There are so many ways you can establish, your own sites, whether it's
Yeah,
Substack or Patreon, or, whatever platform you might want to find. I think that ultimately talent and hard work make it. I found that, so many people come to writers, come to me anyway, and say, I have this really good idea for a novel. Uh, could you help me get an agent? I said, I don't know too many agents who are interested in your good ideas for a novel. They may not even be interested in your novel, but why don't you sit down and write your novel? See if you can do it. See what
yeah,
it turns up, and then start looking for maybe an editor at some publishing house. And there are many, many publishing houses now. Some small ones that really do great work. Uh, so I think everything exists out there. The problem is, and it's been exacerbated, is that what the big publishing houses are looking for is, another Stephen King, another Carolyn Hoover,
yeah,
somebody who's going to make big bucks. They're not really um, creating and nurturing younger mid-list writers, many of whom are becoming YA writers. I think one of the reasons there's so much really good writing in young adult literature now is because a lot of people who would have been writing old adult literature
yeah, yeah,
realize, there's no market for them, but there is market for, I slept with a dragon.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's good, and it's interesting. We take something like Jason Reynolds, and people say, "Well, he's an overnight success." He's not an overnight success. He worked really hard. He went to school, he wrote, he slept on couches of friends, and he worked. And the same thing with Kwame Alexander, who's had a really nice run, but
Yes,
Kwame wrote for a long time when no one cared. He kept writing and figured out how to do school visits and do writing workshops, and you know to say Kwame's an overnight sensation discounts all the work he did for years, right? And I think that there are people who hit a little faster, but I think that's really good advice, Robert. That that hard work and persistence and keep produce something so that when people look around, they say, "Oh, this person's producing something," right? They have something
right.
to
I
show.
mean, yeah, and also it's good for your own soul to find out if you really want to do this thing.
Yeah,
The thing you really have to find out very early is do you want to be a writer or do you want to have written?
That's right.
Now, if you really want to be a writer, that means you kind of love the process and you'll just kind of sit there for hours and hours and try things and work hard and
Yeah.
revise because writing is rewriting. That's
Yeah.
what it's about. Or do you want to have written, which is, get me an agent, I'll give him my idea. And you really need to find that out. You don't want to get stuck
Yeah.
in the process and find out that what you really want to do is something else. You want
Yeah.
to talk about your writing. That's what you want to
Yeah.
do.
That's
Uh,
really great. It's like I told my friends when I left high school, went to university, I said, if I'm back in 2 years, no matter what I say, it's that I can't publish. Right.
in fact, so many writers will say, well, I just, first draft, I just dash it off. And what that is, that's to intimidate
Yeah.
other people coming up behind.
Yeah.
Who wants the competition? Oh, yes. It's really easy. If you can't knock it off the first time, forget about it. Yeah, right. I
Yeah.
mean, we all write and rewrite and rewrite. And probably sometimes you polish it too much, but
That
you
could
have
be.
to do it.
That's why we
Yeah.
need these editors, right, along the way. Well, that's right. So on that note, we'll both leave and go back to work, right?
Oh,
It's
yeah, right. I was afraid you'd say that.
it's been great to talk to you, Robert, and I'm so glad to hear that you've got a new novel coming out. That's great. When it comes out, we'll have to do a little brief thing and produce it and promote it when it hits in January
That'd
again.
be
So
wonderful. Yes.
that'll be great. So you have a great day and thanks for contributing to Dr. Bickmore's Why Wednesday in Conversation.
It was my pleasure. I'm a great fan of Dr. Bickmore. Particularly, he got so much stuff going, conversations, blogs, posts. You're doing all that so you don't have to write.